Following on from that, we're going to move on to exploring breaking unconscious bias. Our panel is going to deep dive into how unconscious bias affects the workplace and society and share strategies for overcoming these hidden prejudices to create a more inclusive future. I'm going to be hosting alongside a great panel. So we have Dr. Belynder Walia, psychotherapist and founder of Serene Lifestyles, Dr. Parves, lead business insight and data transition partner at Channel 4, Shaid, Parveen, associate dean for engagement and development at Aston University School of Law and Social Science, and Jane Knight, founder of Successful Mums Career Academy. Thank you all for being here today. So we're going to open it, the first question up to everyone, talking about unconscious bias as our main topic. How can unconscious bias impact decision-making in the workplace? So like when it makes terms of making decisions, unconscious bias, whether that be hiring, whether that be promoting, whether it be whatever it is, how can it impact those decisions that need to be made?
Well, if I can kick off, it's a great question, Paris, but I think it's a question I think we've been answering for a long time, and it's almost sort of disappointing that we're still talking about unconscious bias in 2025, even that the fact that we're having this discussion is almost a reflection that clearly we haven't progressed far enough. I think to answer the question, we have to really go back and deconstruct what do we mean by bias. I think that would be helpful, and we've got quite a few academics here today, so hopefully we're all on the same page. But for me, I think we have to always remember that we're human and humans all have biases, and actually we're hardwired to have biases. If you think about it, it really stems from our evolutionary past, where sticking to the familiar, sticking to rules of thumbs, sticking to default systems, what we call heuristics in the academic world, was the way that we avoided being eaten by dinosaurs, right? So in a way, we're already designed to not challenge ourselves too much. We like to be familiar. When you add to that years and years of social conditioning around how men and women should behave, it's really kind of tough to cognitively shift how you think about biases, because it's really difficult to challenge prejudices because it becomes so much part of our normal life. What do you think?
So in terms of understanding how unconscious bias works, I agree. I mean, I use the term in terms of if we can encapsulate the phrase birds of a feather flock together, we'll probably find that we gravitate towards the familiar. And we see that everywhere. When I go into a lecture room in the university, you will find that people congregate on the basis of race, basis of class, basis of gender. And that something is natural. But like yourself, I don't think there is a excuse for not understanding unconscious bias and the impact that it has nowadays. Because it's essentially, we're living in a time whereby there has been sufficient education to realise that we need to take accountability for our own biases. And it's that sometimes I feel unconscious bias can actually be weaponised to justify decision-making. But the reality is that if we don't have that accountability, in terms of access in the workplace, in terms of promotion in the workplace, success in the workplace, then we will not get that representation. And for me, it's now the time has really come to make the implicit more explicit, and we need to take more of a realistic stance if we are going to change the workplace.
I want to stay here for a second, just on what you said, Parves, and that we are human, we all have bias, given that it is an unconscious bias. What do you two think about some tools or strategies that individuals can take to address their own and identify their own biases that they have? Because we all have them. Yeah. What would you say are some ways that people can identify them first and foremost?
Well, first of all, to be aware of your biases. And one of the ways that you can do that is slowing down the decision-making process. Because obviously we make these decisions on instinct, gut feelings, and we need to slow that process down. Actually think about be aware of your biases with implicit association test that outlines how you can associate your bias, where they lie. And when you have that understanding of yourself, you are more willing to be self-accepting. When you're more willing to be accepting of those biases, you can make that change and do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Jane, what do you think?
Well, I think we all have blind spots, don't we? And unless somebody kindly points out our blind spots, we're not going to know what that bias might be. And something that we've done quite organically at Successful Mums, it wasn't something I actually planned, but when you bring lots of different women together in a particular room, regardless of their educational or their financial backgrounds, they can really bond. And I think this is really linked. So one example, I can still remember... we was running a back-to-work confidence course, and in the room we had a real mix of women returners. Some of these women had never worked at all. Some of them had sort of low to sort of mid jobs, and some of them had quite senior roles. They all brought something to the table. They was all wanting to work, which was fantastic. And I can still remember we had a lady called Sarah who is a barrister. And when we went round the room introducing ourselves and that we'd lost our confidence, lost our career mojo, as I like to call it, because that's what we do well at Successful Mums, help mums get back their career mojo. When Sarah introduced herself as a barrister, there was a gasp in the room as if, wow, you're a barrister. Why do you need to be on this course? As if barristers are bulletproof. But the reminder here is that barristers are still human beings. And Sarah had triplets, so it was quite full on. But Sarah didn't want to go back to the bar. She wanted to do a different job. But suddenly she was a mother. She still wanted to work, but she just wasn't sure where to start. And so it was just what happened in that. I can still remember that particular group. I mean, we've supported thousands of women, but that group was really special to me because these women that probably might have never met outside of this particular course, they all bonded and they all recognised that they all had this sort of need to have the reassurance and the confidence and the skills and that pathway back into employment. That's what they wanted to do, and they all bonded over that moment of losing their mojo, losing their confidence, but wanting to get back into work. And it was just a real wonderful course just to demonstrate that even if you have a senior role, whether you're a director, and this applies to men as well. We have dads and carers on our courses, and some of these men have had senior, serious jobs. However, they can still lose their way. Anybody can if you've had to take time out of the work place to, care for ageing parents or another reason. So it's all around people understanding other people's situations. And sometimes when you get people together in that type of forum, it can really open people's eyes and then work well in the future.
Yeah.
Can I just go back to something we just started off? But that was a really important point, Jane, because women and men, we all have biases. But I think, Parves, your question was, how does that impact on the workplace? And I think, again, we're very familiar with these terms like confirmation bias. And I think we've all been in this situation, right? So we're in a meeting, right? There's 3 blokes and maybe there's 1 woman or there's 2 women. And we notice that the guys are very forceful, they're talking a lot, whilst maybe we observe that the woman in the meeting is a little quieter, saying a lot less. We could easily come up with the assumption or the bias that, gosh, these guys, they're so confident, they're natural-born leaders. All right, the woman, well, she's meek and mild, obviously, she's a bit more better for a caretaking role, perhaps she's not as confident. It's easier to assume that. It's harder to search for alternative explanation of what's going on. The fact that these guys have had it a lot easier. They've been given a lot more confirmation and a praise to speak openly. They've been given a pat on the back, it's high fives, that they've had more opportunity to be listened to and heard. But that woman, she's been cut off. Every time she talks, she's been, silenced. She hasn't been heard. So she learns to just stay quiet. But she's just as capable. But in our minds, when we just look at that, that's what we think, don't we? And then there's that double standard. How many times have we heard this double standard? A guy is assertive, a woman is bossy.
Yeah.
A guy is ambitious, a woman is selfish. A guy is passionate, but a woman is emotional, or what I've heard oftentimes is she's unhinged. You know, how often do we call a guy unhinged when he's having a really bad day and he's shouting? But if a woman starts shouting, she's had a bad day, it's like, my God, you know, she's unhinged, or she's off her blocker, whatever it is. So what do you think about that, Veen? I think, again, you've had lots of experience with this.
Yes, thank you. So it's interesting that you were talking about that, because it reminded me of a study that was carried out by the Columbian University, and they had equal participants of different backgrounds. And the bias, the unconscious bias, was clearly seen in this, because you had a resume or a CV, and it had exactly the same information. The only thing that was changed were the names. So there was a Heidi and a Howard. And when the participants actually looked at the resume and they saw Heidi's resume, their unconscious bias kicked in, and they said she's coming across although both participants are competent, she's coming across as aggressive, whereas Howard was a good leader. He was competent and efficient, and yet it was the same resume. Did you come across that?
What do you think on that point? Because I think we've heard the assertive, and I hear it a lot. What are some practical steps that people can take to address that, holding people accountable, but still with grace? Say if you're in a meeting and you do notice that someone is maybe not paying attention to their colleague or doing the things that are unconscious bias that we just mentioned, some practical steps that anyone in the audience can take on to do that. I think Shaid wants.
I'm going to use a phrase that I've taken from an ally, Sal Nassim. You've probably seen him on LinkedIn. He's written a great book, The True North. And he uses a phrase, we rise by lifting each other. So if a female colleague has made a statement and then a male colleague echoes that statement, it's fine to say, Parves already said that. So give her that the attribution that is required by it. And I think also the thing about addressing unconscious bias, friction is actually really quite important. Mm-hmm. So it's giving that time to think. I'm going to use an example which was given by Professor Jenny Eberhardt from Stanford University. And it deals with racial profiling, but it can be used in relation to women. So any of you guys part of Nextdoor, the sort of community network, okay? So it's this community network. And what they found was that when people saw people who were black and male outside their neighbourhood, they expressed concern. And it was they were following that mantra: see it, say something. Now, Nextdoor approached the professor at Stanford and said, you know, we note that this is racial profiling taking place. How can we address it? And she basically gave them simple advice. What I want you to do is change the narrative. See it, say something specific. Because then people actually had to pause and explain their decision making. And what they found was actually there was a 75% reduction in terms of racial profiling. So if we take that same strategy and actually get people to be accountable for their reasons, to explain their reasons, cause that friction, there will be a positive change in terms of outcomes.
I think just listening to you there and reminded me for all my commuters out there that might know, see it, say it, sort it. You'll hear it a lot on the trains. I think it's very important. Jane, what about you? Some practical steps you've dealt with. Obviously, you deal with mums who have gone into a workplace and taken setback to their careers, trying to get back. How would you say some practical steps that you give them to like overcome like the anxiety, whatever they have, to go back to work and maybe to face unconscious bias from leaving the office?
Well, I suppose for women returning to work, what I do hear a lot of these women saying is, I'm just a mum, I've got nothing to offer. When in fact, I think being a parent or a carer is a superpower. So I think it's around one's mindset and how society and how the individual talks about themselves. And we use lots of neuro-linguistic programming strategies around self-talk, building rapport with other people, and also educating other people around, well, actually the role of the mum, is obviously it's a really important one, and it's a really hard job as well, and you're not paid for it. So there's all the transferable skills you have from being a parent that you can take into the workplace, for example. And I suppose in my personal experience and having supported all of these women, sometimes, not all the time, and it is getting so much better now, but you may have employers that would think if you're going to take on a parent, for example, they will only want to work 1 day a week, and they might be taking time off with their if their children are poorly. But I mean, that could happen to anybody, couldn't it? And let's face it, if you're lucky enough to be young and going out on a Sunday night, you might have a headache and not go into work on the Monday. So for all of society, there might be a reason why you're not at work. But for parents, surely with the transferable skills you have, and can we just think of 10 transferable skills you have from being a mum that you can take into the workplace? I've got 2 children now, and can I start with conflict management? My conflict management skills are so much better than they used to be. Negotiation. Can we think of some others?
Strategizing, you have to
Absolutely.
strategize.
I think she's asking the audience, but I don't think you hear them.
Time management, absolutely.
Excellent, yeah.
Multitasking. Performing in a high-stress environment. I love that one. There's so many we could go on. And in fact, interestingly, a mum, one of our learners recently, she wanted to be said, I want to retrain as a VA or a PA, but I've never done that before. She had a partner who worked away a lot. She had 5 children. She was her family's personal assistant, but she didn't see that. She was managing all the letters home from school. She was sorting out all the logistics. So I think it's around... and this is linked, I suppose, in terms of how people might presume somebody is and what they do every day. And when people talk about a career break, I mean, is it really a break? I think Emma Barnett was talking recently, wasn't she? I think it was in the Times at the weekend around, she's never worked so hard when she had time out of work to raise her children. So I think it's the terminology, the words, the vocab that we use then can instantly make people think, oh, it is a break, you've had a year off. Well, actually, partly I went back to work for a bit of a break. So I think there's, there's this real, I think with lots of things, you flip it, don't you? And you put yourself in their shoes. And then once you know what that feels like, then you just might have a slightly different slant on the situation.
Yeah, I mean, I can vouch for that. I think motherhood is definitely the perfect training ground for leadership. I mean, if you can deal with terrible 2 tantrums, you can certainly deal with an executive group of leaders who are all like having temper tantrums every 5 minutes. It doesn't change. But listen, look, we're talking about unconscious bias, and I think we have to recognise, and Parves, you said, well, how can we deal with it? We can deal with it at the individual level and the organisational level. We can, and at the individual level, first of all, to recognise that we have these biases. As women, we internalise the same misogynistic views about women as men do. And sadly, in my experience, it's actually often women who have been the most sexist, which is, maybe very disappointing and ironic. But the previous panel actually mentioned that it's disappointing when women don't lift other women. And it was Madeleine Albright, who was one of the advisors to President Clinton, who said that famous quote, there's a special place in hell for women that don't support other women. But look, let's not beat women up about that, because we've all been socialised in exactly the same way. So I think we've got to just, first of all, stop and reflect and think about, am I judging that other woman in exactly the same way that I would judge a man? So one of the challenges that I've experienced as a boss is that I always found women in my team found me difficult at times because they wanted me to be more gentle and more empathetic. And I would often say, Parves, you're a great boss, but you're just very direct. you know, and I would think like, well, why are they always saying that I'm so direct? And my, you know, staff appraisal, I would get feedback that I'm really driven and really direct, as though those were negative things. And I thought about like my predecessor, who were all men, and they were exactly the same, and they didn't have that feedback from their, you know, from their colleagues about being very direct and decisive, because those were positive things. But for me, that was a negative thing, and I really struggled with that, and that's why I wanted to write this book, to understand why women have to face these double standards a lot more. So I think we just need to take a step back and think, am I judging that woman when she's, you know, constantly badgering me about something in the same way that I would judge a man if he had asked me the same thing? So that's what I would say at a personal level. I don't know if you've got views about that.
Shaid?
I just want to go back a bit in terms of what Jane said.
Rewind.
The language. It takes me back from when I was in practice. I was a family lawyer. And I'd get a woman coming in, and I'd say, oh, job title. And she'd say, domestic engineer. What's that? Housewife. And then there's another one in terms of job title. Oh, Home Office Minister. OK, what does that involve? Housewife. So I think, you know, women recognise their worth. And that's really, really important. But also, for me as a woman, it's also important to recognise the intersectionality, because we are fighting so many, I suppose, aspects of challenges. There are a variety of challenges there. And, you know, be it a disabled woman, be it LGBTQT woman, be it a woman of a different colour, a different class. It's so important that we do actually support one another, because it's deeper than just changing systems, processes, because those are just tick boxes. Changing a culture. That's the biggest challenge. And that's what we need to do.
Just staying with you, Shaid, just on that before I go to you, Belynder. You mentioned obviously you were in industry, you were a lawyer, and now you're obviously associate dean, and so you're dealing with students. How do you use your experience from being in industry to maybe tackle that, to get it like cut from before they've even started their first roles, being uni students? Just interested to hear your point.
Yeah, so when I joined Aston 3 years ago, I was appointed as the employability lead. And I remember saying to my boss at that time, I'm only going to engage with firms that are committed to EDI. He looked at me in terms of, oh, we're going to lose people. And then he actually said, do whatever you think is right. So he was my boss at the time. And so when firms, organisations would say effectively, can we engage with you? They would send an email saying, you know, we've got this VAC scheme, etc. I would actually ask for a conversation, and I would assess them in terms of what they are actually offering. And I would also ask them, if you're going to have a panel, what I would want is, I want representation at that panel. That represents the student body as well. I was also quite conscious when I was selecting people for panel to ensure that they represented the student body. I encouraged my panellists to talk about issues that affected women. So quite often I get students saying to me, Shaid, I really want to be a lawyer, but I'm concerned about the fact that it takes... How old do you think, on average, you have to be a lawyer nowadays? Go on, 25, 26? Actually 30 years old, okay? So they would say, I'm worried about my biological clock ticking away. I also want to be a mother as well. I want to get married. And you know what? My advice to them is, do whatever you want to do. Everything else will fall into place. But don't sacrifice what you want to do.
That's good advice. And Belynder and Jane, you are both founders of your own companies. What are some of the things that you would say would give advice in terms of building something from scratch and having to go through that and basically breaking unconscious bias for yourselves?
For ourselves, I think, again, I'm going back to actually being aware of your biases, because that's really important. If you don't understand what your triggers are, you don't understand what your judgments are, where your assumptions are coming from, where they're stemming from, it's very difficult to make that change amongst your colleagues or acquaintances. And I think it's got to start from within. As the panel said earlier on, it has to, because if you don't make that change initially, then trying to implement that amongst those who are your colleagues and display it or demonstrate it in any way, it's not viable, is it?
Yeah.
So it's really difficult to actually demonstrate that. But the thing is, one point I really want to make is that a lot of people don't realise you can retrain your brain.
Yeah.
And you can think differently by pausing and reflecting and seeing where it is that your organisation might be able to make those changes. For instance, when you were talking earlier about the men sitting together and, being the only female, or sometimes I've noticed from my own personal experience that it's the females that have the biases amongst the females as well. And that's the part that I feel we have to change. If we make those changes amongst each other, then it's a lot easier going forward.
Yeah. What about you, Jane?
Well, I think it goes back to the blind spots and asking questions. I mean, I've always had a coach since I've always had a coach. And so I will talk to her about, where do you think my strengths are? Because I think if you know where your strengths are, you can then know where the points you might need to develop and where your biases might be. And also asking people around you and also who you work with, and ask them for their honesty as well, and along with examples, because then it just becomes there's more clarity around, I can see, and I just think it even comes down to your body language in situations, and, where you sit around a table for an important meeting, for example, who you invite to that meeting. There's so many layers, and I mean, your body language, I'm saying that, I'm just sitting here with my laptop in front of me. I've got notes on there, that's why. But your body language even gives messages, doesn't it, around how you engage with people. So then how you might sort of think in a certain way about people. So I think in answer to your question, it's the blind spots and asking people that know you, observe you, for feedback, and then make sure you can sort of have an action plan and improve that with integrity, to make everybody feel inclusive.
Great point. I think it reminds me, my first year of uni, one of the first modules we ever had was like personal skills, and one of the things that our lecturers used to get us to do those superhero poses that you'll have. So like before like a presentation, someone's laughing, for like a presentation or something, like if you really envision like have your key body language, like that confidence, you're more likely to be able to perform. But
that's like that lovely. You might have seen the YouTube. There's a lady called Amy Cuddy, and it's called Fake It Till You Make It. And so she talks about the Wonder Woman pose, doesn't she? Where before an interview, you need to stand up.
Yeah, that's the one.
You've got is it your superwoman
Yeah.
pants on? And then, and I'm wearing mine, by the way. But then those people before an interview, if you stand like that, in the toilets or in the hallway, wherever you are, those people were more likely to be successful at interviews. So there's lots of things. It's YouTube's Amy Cuddy, no affiliation, but it's just great. And we use that with our students as well, which has worked really well.
Yeah, it worked for us, definitely. And Parves, I'm interested to go to you, being a partner at a big organisation. Like one of my final questions for all of you, but touching on your point, is how can organisations specifically promote a culture of inclusion by tackling unconscious bias? Obviously, we talk very individually now, but how can organisations help?
I work for Channel 4, which is probably one of the most progressive public service broadcasters out there. I'm sure that's true of the BBC as well. And Channel 4's remit is very much to provide programming for more of the underserved communities. So you would think, right, that would be represented in its workforce. But Channel 4 discovered, when it did a survey back in 2016, that it was the poshest public service broadcaster in the UK in terms of its workforce. So listen, it has loads of women in Channel 4, has loads of people of colour, but then when you look at the leadership, and I don't mind saying this, and I'm sure I won't get into trouble, it's very, very white. And the problem that we have at Channel 4 is we actually have a lot of white women in very senior positions, but we don't have a lot of black women or brown women or black men in positions of power. It goes back to a point you've made really importantly, I think, which is this kind of affinity bias, which is really difficult to call out. Because if you're in an interview and you've got great candidates, they're all really brilliant, 5 of them are white, 1 of them's black, but they're all brilliant, and you're a white person, you might just feel that affinity, and it's difficult. You're not even like tangibly demonstrating any type of bias, but it's just psychological. And you may just end up hiring the person that looks more like you, dresses like you. I mean, at Channel 4, it means everybody wears jeans and trainers. I mean, I never wear jeans and trainers, so I'm a complete and utter outlier. So there is that. And it goes back to those individual biases, even at organisational level. It's really difficult to change. Listen, we've got loads and loads of initiatives. And the thing about things like unconscious bias training is it is not a one-off. If you keep it as a one-off, then that's token. It is constant reinforcement. There is no algorithm for changing biases, and humans are not zeros and ones. So we need constant reinforcement learnings. That means lots and lots of repeated exercises to challenge our thinking. And that's how, we do things like Channel 4. But that is bloody expensive. So companies, really have to be committed to do things like that. What about the university?
Yeah, and universities, but also obviously law is like your back. You mentioned obviously the example you gave with women. Like one of my friends, she passed the bar first time, and like we talk conversations about it because we are like, okay, what are our life plans? Like, what are we doing? What about how can organisations help that to help like build that?
Again, like Channel 4, the higher education professes to be this liberal system way of thinking, and also the legal profession as well. Bearing in mind 52% of the legal profession are women, but it boils down to the fact when you look at who is leading at the top, it will tend to be white, male, pale, stale men. So
No offence to men.
yeah, there is no offence, but that's the reality. But also the thing is, in terms of we keep on saying data is now king. So let's take that data. Data can be empowering. So what we need to do is we need to start looking at the data, and we need to ask the question, why is this still the case in 2025? That, in terms of equity partners in the legal profession within the large firms, it's only 28% who are women. And I'm sure if you looked at it, dissected it from an intersectionality perspective, when it comes to women of colour, you'll probably see less. In terms of vice chancellors, we're only seeing less than a quarter are actually women. So in terms of it's about using that data and using it in an empowering way to ask the questions, and also to ask the relevant EDI teams, leadership management teams, to actually put measures into place which have impact. Because we see policies being implemented day in and day out, but they don't have impact, they don't have longevity, they need to be sustainable, and also, more importantly, the leadership team needs to be held to account.
I think it's a really good point. I don't know, Belynder, you want to add on to the other point being?
Well, another point is where people are gravitated to people that are similar to them. I think perhaps it will be an idea to actually go into looking at resumes, CVs blindly and taking out those details of ethnicity and gender and things like that, because I think where we're using that familiar mindset and that unconscious bias comes into play because we're trying to make those decisions very quickly by gut instinct. We've got to move away from that gut instinct and slow the process down and fill the gaps. And
No, sorry, I'm just going to... one of the things I do really feel passionately about is these types of initiatives shouldn't be top down. They really need to be very ground up in many ways, because otherwise it can feel like, you know, it's sort of a carrot and stick type of situation. You can feel like, oh, you're racist or you're sexist or you're homophobic. And that doesn't work, because that's when, you know, the woke agenda backfires and you see the likes of Trump, and I can go on for that for ages. But it does backfire, you know, and we need men as allies, and we need to, you know, accept that people don't all think alike. So let me give you a quick example. I know that we're going to run out of time. Yesterday at Channel 4, we had an inclusive language workshop. And again, this point I'm making about repeating these types of exercises. And it was about language around race. And we had some outside speakers who came to say, should we be using the concept ethnic minorities, so to say, Channel 4 has certain percentage of ethnic minorities, or should we use the term Channel 4 has a certain percentage of minoritized ethnicities? And we were like, what does that mean? Because minoritized ethnicities introduces a power dynamic, because these people are minoritized. They're not in the most senior jobs. They tend to be, you know, in lower level positions. But you know what? It was a really huge backlash by people of colour at Channel 4. Like, piss off, we don't want to be called minoritized. You know, we are really like, you know, really strong, powerful people in this company, and where we want to celebrate our ethnic diversity, and you know, we don't want to be othered, thank you very much. So actually there isn't even necessarily a common narrative amongst people of colour. We all have different opinions, but what I love about these types of conversations is we can also disagree, and we can have difference, and that's really important. We should not silence people who you might think, oh, that sounds a bit racist, we shouldn't, I don't like what you're saying, because if you do that, then you will have the likes of, you know, really awful people like Andrew Tate with misogyny, and I'm sure lots of other racist people. Because if they're silenced and they haven't got a platform to share their opinion, well, then everyone is politically correct, and we can't ever say anything, and that's not good either. So I just wanted to illustrate that as an example of how we're trying to do things differently at Channel 4.
No, it's good you mentioned that, actually, and we are out of time, but it flows on very nicely to our next session, which will happen after a break, which is excelling in your space as a minority. So we are going to hear from some, so it's really cool that you mentioned that. So yeah, thank you very much to our panel.